Jazz and Erwin Schulhoff go together. Perhaps it was George Gross's recordings, some of the first recordings made of jazz. Perhaps it was his hanging out in nightclubs, especially in the city of Cologne. But he quickly caught the bug and he stayed with it, convinced that it was the music of the future. He was right. He saw infinite possibilities in it. And in certain respects, we can imagine that he imagined a marriage between classical music and jazz elements. Now, it's been pointed out that almost every composer, after a certain point, made pieces of jazz, Stravinsky, Poulenc, Milhaud, Bernstein, everybody. But for the most part, they were adopting a technique or a vocabulary for a piece, a characteristic piece, jazz piece. Schulhoff integrated it far more deeply. So it wasn't a flirtation. It was a deeper relationship. And that's going to be played out in many forms. Now, jazz was introduced into Europe by Black American soldiers. The 369th Regiment contained in it an extraordinary band. James Reese Europe was the director of that band, and he made his place in history with that band. And that's how Europe first discovered, or how jazz came to Europe. And then after the war, it starts to seep into Europe, first from France, but then into German and the German-speaking lands, and it makes its impression. Schulhoff caught it early, clearly. Now, he also recounted playing in nightclubs. I mean, there he started playing, and there he started improvising, and he was very well known as somebody who could improvise brilliantly, and so he improvised on jazz. So he learned it in that context. So we have the arrival of jazz, and it's being gradually recognized, adopted, rejected, many things when it came to Europe. But it all comes from James Reese Europe and the 369th Regiment, the Black Regiment of the U.S. Army during the First World War. Now, in the early 20s, Schulhoff is aware of all the new currents, including the 12-tone serial music of Arnold Schoenberg and Expressionism. And he's going to flirt with it. In fact, one of his great works, chamber works, is his sextet, string sextet, which he started in 1920 and follows Schoenberg's principles for that movement. But it took him 3 to 4 years to continue on and write the other 3 movements. And why? The hypothesis is he came to a standstill. This was not for him. He couldn't go forward with it. So he abandoned it as of the second movement, and then he wrote a piece that, came out of his own nature. So there is some jazz to be found in that piece, but there is also the beginning of his discovering the Czech non-German tradition. Remember I mentioned at the beginning, he was German-speaking, German-educated, and that the division between the German and Czech worlds was in certain cases very strong. And when it came to aesthetics, he wrote for newspapers in German. He was on the German side of that question. And yet neither the Germans nor the Czechs were comfortable with him. And that's because he always walked to the beat of his own drum. So his sextet becomes a masterpiece, and it's a hybrid. You have one expressionistic Schoenbergian movement, and then the rest is already enveloped in that developing awareness of Czech music. I don't know where it started, but one anecdote I heard that while he was in Cologne, that he became, he got employment as a rehearsal pianist, and I believe under Otto Klemperer. At the time, Leos Janáček's Jenůfa was being premiered, and he played it. And that seemed to be his first real experience of Czech nationalist music. Now, also subsequently, in the years when he was finding it more and more difficult to find employment, one of his jobs would be to research older Czech music, and of course he became more interested in it as time went on. But as of the early 20s, as jazz is in full bloom and will remain so for a good deal of the 20s, he's also branching out now to get into folk roots, similar to the way Bartók did. Now, perhaps not as systematically as Bartók did it, but it is the same instinct and with the same results that he began to integrate these into his works. Now, the collapse of the Habsburg Empire, the splitting up of what was the Austro-Hungarian Empire into its component parts, emphasized and inspired more interest in what was Hungarian, what was Czech. And so Bartók does for Hungary, and Schulhoff, although he will not be a leader in that, Janáček absolutely was, he will not be unaffected by it. He will integrate that into his music of the period.
Schulhoff Violin Sonata is easily one of the most demanding works that I've ever had to wrestle with, and I did wrestle with it literally. I mean, there's just so many difficult technical passages. He incorporates a lot of extended technique, like left-hand pizzicato that comes in frequently, or like this strumming pizzicato that's very rapid. A wild amount of double stops when you play two strings at once in the end of the whole sonata that ties everything together. It comes into this kind of frenzy of violin playing where it feels like a party kind of gone out of control maybe, and I'm kind of battling with the pianist at the very end to bring everything together. I feel like he was a very fiery personality, honestly. Just there's a lot of raw emotion in his music that's also countered with tremendous tenderness and playfulness that happens throughout the course of a lot of his works. I mean, you can have dynamic shifts from something that's very in your face and kind of rough and aggressive and folk-like, and then that would just shift beautifully to a quiet, chromatic, jazz-inspired, soft, tender harmony. And this can happen in the blink of an eye, which is very present in his violin sonata in particular. I think you just really understand the brilliance and the fire of him as a person. It really speaks through his music, I feel.
When it comes to jazz and Schulhoff and nightclubs, I'd like to recount one personal anecdote from my own life. Some years ago, on a trip to Leipzig to conduct the Gewandhaus, I bought a guidebook to the city, fascinating, and I saw being sold right outside music in Leipzig. And you don't see that in every city. Of course, Leipzig is like the Florence of Germany. It's an amazing center. It's unbelievable to think that Bach, Mendelssohn, Schumann, Wagner all came from this small area, but they did. And so the book, I look through the book, I go through everything, and I get towards the end, and I find Erwin Schulhoff. And I said, isn't that wonderful and encouraging? That's the first time I have ever seen one of the composers who was suppressed by the Nazis featured alongside of Bach, Mendelssohn, Schumann, Wagner. That's, of course, one of my great goals and a mission for the future, the day when that will be normal. But I was so happy with that book, so I, of course, read the whole Schulhoff entry right away, and it had the address of where he lived briefly when he lived in Leipzig. So on an afternoon off, I went down there looking for this house and hoping to see a plaque. Erwin Schulhoff lived here. Nothing of the kind. I finally came to the conclusion that I was standing right in front of it. And what did I see? I saw a jazz club that was all boarded up and clearly had closed down for a long time. And I walked up and down the stairs. I took pictures and said, this is amazing. Isn't it ironic that the house or the building he lived in, small building, obviously subsequently became a jazz club. So it was for me a meaningful anecdote. First, to find his name where I like seeing it alongside all of these well-known composers. And secondly, to find that house and to see that perhaps the spirit of jazz that Schulhoff certainly brought into the building was still there in subsequent years in one form or another. Dance rhythms and Schulhoff are another important marriage. He was fascinated with dance. And in fact, in an essay he wrote where he was very critical of classical musicians, all of us who have grown up with that, he said, "You're not normal any longer." And I'm paraphrasing, of course, but what did he mean by normal? He said, the common man, who, and he meant men and women, who are not educated in music, all know how to dance, and they all know their local dance. He's not talking about ballroom dancing, he's talking about folk dancing, and they have natural rhythm in them. And he wanted to use the energy of that rhythm. So what did he start doing? He started writing jazz pieces. Now, he wrote rags, very similar to Scott Joplin. Did he ever hear a rag of Scott Joplin's? I doubt it. Could he have heard other rags or something that suggested that to him? Yes, but he embraced the rag right away. Then he decided to write a suite for chamber orchestra. And that suite is like a Bach suite, which has the dances of the time, the sarabande, the courant, the minuet, all of that. Well, he did the same thing. He's found the shimmy and tango, all of those forms that were popular, the Boston waltz at the time, all of those, and he put them into a suite. That was his way of saying what mattered at the time of Bach was to take popular dance rhythm and to put them into their forms. And that's exactly what he did with this dance suite. And you will have already heard a short excerpt from it at the beginning of this episode. That will continue on. And I think it's going to come perhaps to a climactic piece, which is the sonata for saxophone and piano, which is known as the Hot Sonata. The saxophone, as you might, barged into European music. Unbidden at first, it came from America. It was introduced together with jazz. It was resented by all of the conventional composers. It was considered many things to many people, but the establishment rejected its use and vilified it. So consequently, in the 20s, it became a symbol of the rebellion against the old order and became, for that reason, very popular. Now, you'll see the painters of the 20s, Otto Dix in particular, you'll see use of the saxophone as a symbol. And it's a symbol of what? A symbol of this new force of rhythm coming from another world, in this case, America. But because it's also Black America, there's an association with Black Africa. And so these are this is the rhythm, this is the pulse, this is the dynamism of music that had not been subjected to classical tradition. And that's exactly what it was meant to do. That's what the saxophone did. So the saxophone enraged many. It was to enrage the Nazis subsequently, and they were to include any use of saxophone they were to include that as a qualification to have your music considered degenerate music, Entartete Musik. At the same time, it was very popular. And by the way, certain hypocritical individuals, Joseph Goebbels, for instance, as he condemned jazz, Jewish composers, the saxophone, in public, he was a mad fan, and he had jazz records delivered to him by diplomatic pouch out of London regularly. So we see that there's an ambivalent relationship to the saxophone and jazz, but we see how powerful it is that it inspired both passion and enthusiasm and revulsion and hatred. One of my favorite pieces is a ballet called Ogallala. This was a piece he wrote in the early 20s, some say with the possible influence of Bartók and the Miraculous Mandarin in particular. And I've often noticed the similarity in certain places. But it should be pointed out that this piece was premiered before the Miraculous Mandarin. And unless he actually saw the score of Bartók's before it was performed, there is no way that that could have been the case. In fact, perhaps it's the opposite. But in any case, he chose a subject that was to come from pre-Columbian America. We see a step toward, once again, trying to harness what the Europeans would have considered primitive energy. And this ballet, to me, is a rhythmic, electric work that never stops, incessant in its strength. I happen to have conducted the American premiere of Ogallala around 2006 and 2007. Now, once I did it in a concert, but subsequently, as a part of a program where at Juilliard I was an artist in residence, and working with each department, I asked if I could commission 3 works for dance based on composers of the recovered voices. Why? Because I thought that was an excellent way that people would hear this music and without suspecting or knowing why they were listening to it. So one of those works was Ogallala, and it was choreographed by the brilliant Robert Battle. And that work has gone on to be danced again and played again, and I'm particularly proud of it. What do I like so much about this music? As in almost all of the other ballets at the time, almost every composer at that time wrote a significant ballet. Now, these were not churning out ballets for a system, as was customary in the 19th century. Each one of these composers had his own particular take. Of course, Stravinsky, the most important, but it's going to be Bartók, it's going to be Dufay, and it's going to be, amongst others, Schulhoff. And that's going to go on because the ballet itself was being freed from the strictures of the older forms. So Schulhoff participates in this ongoing liberation of the dance from the classical forms. And what we see gradually emerging is a composer who is very versatile. He has written piano concerti. He's going to write a second one in the late 20s, which is very deeply imbued with the jazz feeling, and I would say prescient of the Ravel Concerto for Left Hand. He's writing piano music. He starts writing a lot of chamber music in the 20s. He's going to write the first of his 6 symphonies in the 20s. He's going to attempt an opera. It's not going to be very successful, but he did start at least work on an opera, and it's complete in the sense that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. But it was never produced. It does not make a coherent entity, but it just shows you that he was able to put his hands across the spectrum and create in all of these areas. Now, Schulhoff was, in many respects, more successful than other people. He actually had a music publisher, and it was no less than Universal in Vienna. And so he had a contract, and he began fulfilling those contracts. And to begin with, it started with the symphonies, but many other works. Now, what happened was he was so fertile at the time that he kept giving them too many works, and they started, for whatever reason, I don't know why, they started getting annoyed by that, and so the relationship started to get rocky. Now, apparently, he was a demanding, difficult man. Many composers are. Beethoven was no less so. That started to also affect the enthusiasm of Universal. And finally, in the 30s, when the jazz madness started to no longer be new, his insistence on continuing to write in his jazz pieces was no longer attractive to them. So they stopped. And that, of course, is a tragedy because it became very difficult for him to get his pieces published after that, and very difficult to get them performed. Many pieces by Schulhoff, unless they were solo pieces or chamber musics, never got performed. And so he didn't have a very important privilege that the composers whose works are performed have. And what is that? The opportunity to hear his pieces and to criticize his own pieces and to revise them. And he surely would have done this, much more so, had he had that opportunity. but he would write the piece, it would go down on paper, and would very often go nowhere after that. So he never had an opportunity to be able to stand apart from it, hear it, see it, sense what he might want to revise, as many other composers have done in the past. Now, Universal fell out of the picture. He began to have lots of financial difficulties, and then things became more and more difficult gradually. And that's going to, of course, go into its most critical stage in the 1930s, and in the late 30s in particular, with the arrival of the Nazis in Berlin, but their eventual influence on life in Czechoslovakia as well. And so the limits and the banning of Jewish musicians and even getting employment became an issue. He was going to suffer under that. Schulhoff liked to write pieces for combinations of instruments that are very uncommon. For instance, piano concertos and violin concertos have dominated, but not double concertos, and if double concertos, usually two strings, but not, as he wrote one, for flute and piano. That is another way he has of bending the rules of concertos. Take, for instance, a piece called Concertino, which is written for flute, viola, and contrabass. That's a very odd combination of instruments. Take 1930, a work that he premiered on the radio, at the early days of radio transmission of music. A concerto for string quartet, but not as you might expect with string orchestra, with wind instruments. In other words, basically a band. Now that's a wild combination. And I've done that on 2 occasions, and it's very difficult to balance that because you have all these, it's like a marching band, and then you've got a string quartet that has to fight against it. But then when you realize it was written for radio, where that could be balanced perfectly, it, of course, created no problems. But these are all manifestations of that rebellious streak. Let's do it another way. Let's not take anything for granted that because it was done this way, we should do it. No, it's almost the opposite. Because it was done that way, let's do something else. Another example of experimental combinations of instruments. In the jazz suite, there is one movement for percussion only. And so you might say, well, big deal. We know lots of pieces for not at the time, not at all at the time. In fact, he was to write that before, for instance, Shostakovich, who wrote excerpts for all percussion, or before Edgar Varese, who wrote entire pieces for just percussion. Okay, now we know that, but at the time, this was unheard of. And once again, he showed himself to be ahead of others in that movement. Another example, alongside of the saxophone, of an American instrument finding its way into European music life is the banjo. Now, he uses the banjo in his ballet Ogallala, obviously for local color, although it's an anachronism. And he liked it at least enough to include it as a part of his second symphony, which was written in the early 1930s. So these pieces of these fragments of challenges to the European tradition keep coming up, even in what is relatively a very classical symphony, the Second Symphony. Certainly of all of his symphonies, the most classic. But even there, he will never let himself go back to that era without some commentary to distance himself and distance ourselves from that music and that era. He wrote several string quartets and a lot of music for string quartet, but his masterpiece in my mind is the sextet. 2 violins, 2 violas, 2 celli, exactly like Verklärte Nacht of Schoenberg. In this work, I feel he touched a deep place within himself, and especially a very dark place. The first movement was written under the influence of Schoenberg and his attempt to try out serial music, 12-tone technique. And then he went more into his soul and into the constantly evolving relationship to Czech roots. And that work, which ends very tragically and very darkly, not with a brilliant ending as was customary for string quartets. Now, you may have a brooding second movement. He does. But then you'd go on to some lively dance in the third movement and probably some kind of brilliant fast movement. On the contrary, he takes a very slow movement and it very gradually darkens until it goes to sleep. One feels into eternity. Now, I think of that as a very interesting and prescient work. He could not possibly have known anything in the early 1920s about the fate that awaited him and millions of others in Europe. But he had already seen a lot of death and suffering in the First World War. And I think he was bringing that experience to that piece. When one hears Schulhoff, vivacious, the joie de vivre, the dance rhythms, the joy, the satire, the humor, most of all, the life energy, it is very hard to envision the tragic end of his life, preceded by years of professional difficulty, of economic hardships, of isolation, and eventually his death of tuberculosis in a Nazi concentration camp. When I hear the sextet with hindsight, that's what I hear. Bye.